Bienvenidos. This is a podcast that explores Latinx media and culture in its many forms. I am Dr. Rojo Robles.
And I am Dr. Rebecca El Salois. And we are Latinx and Latin American Studies professors at Baruch College in New York City. In this podcast, we will analyze Latinx film, television, literature, art, and cultures.
We will consider how these works are perceived, analyze them, and investigate the real-world reflections and implication of that work on Latinx cultures in the U.S. and beyond.
Welcome to Latinx Visions.
Bienvenidas, bienvenidos, bienvenides.
Welcome back, everyone. Welcome to Season 7 of Latinx Visions. This season, we are focusing on speculative narratives. We're going to start by defining what speculative fiction and speculative narratives are, since that will be the focus of the season. And then we're going to share some background information on each of the authors and some collections of short stories that we're analyzing today. Well, yours is part of a larger collection by one author, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's a series of fictionalized biographies. I will get into that very soon. So during the main segment of the episode, I will be exploring how Chilean writer Roberto Bolaño uses the speculative genre to unpack and critique the influence of fascism in Las Américas, and Rebecca will consider the ways in which monster stories can be rewritten as a tool of women's empowerment. As we have done in the past season, we will wrap up with a section in which we connect the short story choices we have made to one another.
So first up, what is speculative fiction? Well, speculative fiction is a broad genre that explores possibilities and impossibilities. They are, one might say, the sort of like what-if stories about our world and beyond.
Speculative fiction includes several subgenres, including science fiction, fantasy, horror, alternate histories, magical realism, and more. However, not every sci-fi, fantasy, or horror story is speculative fiction. It needs to include non-realistic elements.
Yeah, that's important. So what are some examples of these non-realistic elements? And this doesn't mean the story has to have all of them, but at least one or two of them, right? So first, we have a setting that's imaginary or perhaps extraterrestrial. A story which includes magical elements, creatures, or powers. Or perhaps there are futuristic elements, right? It could be a dystopia or a utopia, or even like an apocalyptic or post-apocalyptic world. It might be an AU, an alternate universe story, something historical or mythological, reimagined. Or there could be imaginary monsters or other living beings, or even characters who wield special powers. So there's a lot of things it could entail, but it doesn't need to have all of it.
Yeah. This is not, of course, an exhaustive list. Speculative fiction is about extraordinary circumstances, a situation where characters have to navigate conflicts that don't exist in our reality, or maybe that they're latent in our reality. But it should be noted that speculative fiction will often incorporate varying degrees of real-world factors. Maybe a real setting, but with monster, or maybe a fictional setting with real social issues, that sort of thing. If futuristic or supernatural elements are essential to the story's progress, then we can consider it as speculative fiction.
All right, so what speculative fiction are we going to be looking at today? What's your focus?
So today I will talk about some sections of Roberto Bolaño's sui generis 1996 book, Nazi Literature in the Americas, La Literatura Nazi en las Américas. As with most of his books, this is an inventive work that blends fiction and non-fiction in a satirical way. Presented as a plausible literary encyclopedia, the book profiles imaginary writers and literary figures across the American hemisphere who are united not only by their far-right ideologies, but also by the banality of the writer's life.
Ooh, interesting.
So let me introduce a little bit about Bolaño for those who doesn't know him. Roberto Bolaño lived from 1953 to 2003, and he was a very prolific Chilean writer whose work has impacted contemporary Latin American literature and all the tiny Latin American literary section in U.S. bookstores. You can find
tiny.
him everywhere.
They're tiny, but he's there.
He's always there with Gabriel Garcia Marquez. So born in Santiago, he was born in Chile. He spent his early years in La Ciudad de Mexico before returning to Chile in the early 1970s during the government of socialist President Salvador Allende. During the onset of the right-wing military and early Augusto Pinochet regime, Bolaño used to say that he was briefly imprisoned, an experience that profoundly influenced his writing and his eventual exile. He later moved back to Mexico and then to Spain, where he lived for the rest of his life. Bolaño's works include novels, poems, short stories, and essays, and they often delve into themes of displacement, violence, and the blurry interplay between literature and reality, or the speculative play between literature and reality. His most acclaimed novels, Los Detectives Salvajes y 2666, are celebrated for their intricate narrative with multiple voices and deep exploration of human experience at the margins and under sociopolitical repression. Despite his untimely death at 50, Bolaño's legacy endures, cementing his status as a central figure in global literature.
Yeah. I mean, that's that sort of life. I don't know how it couldn't influence your writing if you're a writer. Mm-hmm. So I'm going to be looking at something a little more contemporary. It was published just last year, 2 years ago. It's a short story from a collection called Our Shadows Have Claws. And this is a collection of Latin American and Latino monster stories, published in 2022. The collection includes 15 short stories written by Latinas and was edited by Shamile Said Mendez and Amparo Ortiz. So my focus alludes to the political a little bit, but not so directly as yours. It's more a personal narrative. So in the short story La Madrina, which is going to be my focus, the main character, Rocio, confronts death and considers what survival might look like. La Madrina was written by one of the book's editors, the Argentinian-American author Shamile Said Mendez. Said Mendez is the author of a number of books for both young readers and adults, including titles such as Furia, Where Are You From, and Twice a Quinceañera. And that's like a young reader, a picture book, and an adult novel. Like she's writing
just like
across
Bolaño, she works in many different genres.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. She's received a number of book awards and honors, including a Whitney Award and an Américas Award. She was the 2021 inaugural Pura Belpré Young Adult Gold Medalist for her book Furia. Said Mendez was born and raised in Rosario, Argentina, but has lived the majority of her life in Utah. She is a Voices of Our Nations graduate and the Vermont College of Fine Arts MFA Writing for Children and Young Adults program.
So now that we know a bit about our authors and topics, let's explore them further. I'm going to start with a little context on the book La Literatura Nazi en las Américas. Through crafted fictional biographies merged with real literary facts in Nazi literature in the Americas, Roberto Bolaño explores the intersections of politics, literature, and right-wing fanatism, creating a speculative literary history that reads as possible. Divided into thematic sections, each entry in the book delves into these invented characters' lives, works, and obsessions. It showcases Bolaño's trademark literary knowledge as an unruly reader and his consistent dark humor. Also, his insight into the opacity of the human condition under authoritarianism. Mm-hmm. Originally written in Spanish and translated to English by Chris Andrews, Nazi Literature in the Americas is a sharp critique of fascism and literary culture as propaganda. In the book, Bolaño centers on the effects of fascism in intellectual circles and in isolated writers working at the fringe of society. In simple terms, fascism is a political ideology characterized by strong, centralized power, often led by an authoritarian leader. It emphasizes extreme nationalism, fear of migrants, racism, jingoism, or warlike foreign policy, the suppression of opposition, the native, the racialized, and the queer. Fascism also fosters full control of society and the economy. These regimes typically use propaganda, censorship, and violence to eliminate dissent, maintain control, and promote their agenda.
Right.
Because we're examining speculative narrative during this season, I will focus on one section of the book, aptly titled Speculative and Science Fiction.
That's an easy choice then.
Literal. Comprising 3 texts, this section emphasizes U.S. practices of fascism and right-wing narrative that our listeners will probably recognize. This section will give us the opportunity to see how a Latin American writer presents a timely mirror to U.S. society.
Yeah.
So let me get to it. The first writer in this section, J.M.S. Hill, and the date that Bolaño gives us is 1905 to 1936, prolifically wrote Wild West novels, Ku Klux Klan cavalry adventures, detective books, and science fiction, sometimes combining these genres. Bolaño's encyclopedic narrator says that his fiction settings are desolate, vast, and cold, reflecting a dystopic Midwest.
I think it's interesting that he was prolifically writing all of this stuff, but he allegedly only lived 31 years.
Yeah.
So that's a lot of hatred in a short amount of time.
He was vomiting a lot of books in his 20s, yeah? Indeed, a solitary writer who died young in his 30s, Hill constantly got inspired by the U.S. Civil War, the Confederates, and their philosophies of white supremacy and slavery as the ideal economic motor of the U.S. However, Hill writes from a distorted present or a quote, distant future full of abandoned, ruined cities and ominous silent landscape, end of quote. Mm-hmm. To expand on this topic, let me summarize the Confederate social and cultural ideology.
This fascism, Confederates, here we go.
Well, the book is Nazi literature in the Americas, so it gets into this, right?
Yeah.
So the Confederates believe in the preservation of a hierarchical society. The social structure of the Confederacy was deeply hierarchical, with a clear division between the wealthy plantation owners at the top and the enslaved Afro-descendants at the bottom. This hierarchy was defended as natural and beneficial, with the belief that slavery provided a stable and orderly society. Another point that is very embedded within the Confederate ideology is that they promoted Southern nationalism, Nacionalismo del Sur. The Confederacy emphasized distinct cultural, social, and economic differences from the North. This included a strong emphasis on honor, tradition, the protection of white women, and a perceived superior Anglo way of life that was threatened by native, Mexican, and African cultures.
Of course.
Northern industrialism and abolitionism.
That's a lot, right? Like all of the, that's basically everyone besides themselves.
Everybody who is non-white.
Non-white
right?
and non-Southern.
In brief, the Confederate political and economic ideology was characterized by a strong defense of states' rights and slavery, an agrarian economy reliant on enslaved labor and cash crop exports, and a resistance to the industrialization and ideas that were transforming the North. Mm-hmm. So, going back to Bolaño's fictional writer, J.M.S. Hill, used his more than 30 novels and 50 stories to elaborate on this ideology and speculate on its future survival. Bolaño's narrator tells us that Hill's narratives are dedicated to heroes and titans in long expeditions who traverse and dominate vast landscapes and the native population. Hill obviously believes in the myth of manifest destiny, which advances the conception that it was the clear and obvious fate of the United States to expand its territory across North America. Inspired by the European conquest of the Americas and Africa, this belief was popular in the 19th century. It was used to justify the country's westward expansion at the expense of Native American lands. People who supported Manifest Destiny, like the fictional Hill, believed that this expansion was inevitable and a righteous thing, bringing progress and civilization. For Hill, who worked in the speculative genre, the future still holds the promise of an ideal republic based on these notions.
Wow.
Bolaño's narrator also discusses another branch of Hill's fictions which takes place in interplanetary realms.
Okay, we're switching gears here.
Yeah, these galactic spaces are not exempt from racist configurations.
Of course.
Hill's fictions argue for the belief in the inferiority and savagery of local population, the elimination of migrants, and the urgent need for colonization. Through this biography, Bolaño contextualizes how the pulp genres allow the circulation and expansion of colonialist and racist tropes. Bolaño implicitly suggests that these playbooks were central to the U.S. neocolonial expansion through corporations and itinerant military interventions in Latin America and the Caribbean. Mm-hmm. In this sense, fiction is not an independent fantasy space, but a platform to amplify and justify colonialism and the resentment against racialized people.
It's interesting because we often think about science fiction as like progressing society. But when you really get down to a lot of science fiction writing, it is about issues of colonization. It's a reflection of what's happening.
Of society and the politics of the time.
Exactly, right. So when it's written and what it's written about, they might not be the same thing, but they're sending the same message.
So let me get to the second writer or second text of that section on speculative fictions. So the second writer in Bolaño's speculative and science fiction section is Zach Southernstern, who lived in 1962 until 2021. Okay. And remember that the novel was published in 1996, so he was also like speculating about the future here.
Oh, that's right. That's right.
Based in Los Angeles, Southernstern wrote 3 interconnected sagas of more than 10 books unified by the character of Gunther O'Connell and his mutant dog Flip.
Sure.
Yeah. There's also a lot of satire and jokes, muchos chistes literarios here. So Bolaño also like it's very playful. He's always like he's always playing, with like exaggerated elements, such as this one. Yeah. So Gunther O'Connell has a mutant dog, Flip. Yeah, and Bolaño described him as a stray German shepherd with telepathic powers and Nazi tendencies.
A dog with Nazi tendencies.
So these sagas depict the U.S. as a chaotic and violent state where society mostly collapsed after earthquakes and gangster political coups.
Sure.
The threading character O'Connell starts as a teenager and ends as an old man, and Bolaño's narrator explained that these sagas portrayed a succession of, quote, extreme violence, unpleasant situation, and continuous acts of aggression, end of quote. Southernstern doesn't use this backdrop to spell moral lesson or suggest solution. The reader can distill from Southernstern's literary universe that absurd violence is at the center and the most inherent characteristic of the U.S.
Yeah.
Bolaño's narrator explains that apart from the recurrent acts of violence, Southernstern tends to use O'Connell and Flip's conversations to elaborate on fundamental Protestantism and his racist views against African American, Jews, and Latino people, especially Mexicans. These groups are seen in his works as hordes who are invading and devouring everything in their path. These supposed barbarians destroyed the remnants of U.S. civil life.
Wow. That's...
Of course, understood through whiteness.
Of course, yeah.
Through this entry, Bolaño presents how the white supremacy imaginary focuses on the idea that U.S. civilization is always in danger of collapsing because of the presence of multiculturalism, multilingualism, and sexual and gender differences. Reminiscent of most Westerns, the lone white hero must survive all the paranoias created and repeated by fascist fearmongers. In a terrible premonition, Southernstern articulates that a needed change to the ruined world will only come through a full Nazi government, the Fourth Reich.
Wow. Wow. I mean, he's not like pulling any punches here. He's really going for the jugular.
Yeah, and Bolaño sometimes get really intense in that way. Yeah, as a warning. Yeah. The last fictional biography in this section is dedicated to Gustavo Borda, who was born in 1954 and died in 2016. He is a Guatemalan science fiction writer, possibly of indigenous descent, who grew up as the son of an overseer on a plantation. He voraciously read the books from the owner's library. While this is mentioned in passing, Bolaño's narrator suggests that this upbringing set Borda on a path of humiliation.
Interesting.
The great signifier of indigenous African and Asian exploitation throughout the Americas, the plantation, is a place that generates in Borda or for Borda a desire for whiteness and European beauty standards. This was reflected in Borda's fiction, which was populated by white German people with plots connected to the conquest and pillage of indigenous civilizations in the Americas. The narrator explains that Borda eventually moves to Los Angeles, constantly falling in love with and pursuing white women in Hollywood. Rejection was the norm, along with racist beatings and ridicule at science fiction conventions. Bolaño's narrator ends this short entry quoting Borda, who explains that after confronting all this humiliation, he could only live and write by creating, quote, a spiritual refuge in an ideal place.
And quote, I'm worried about what this ideal place is.
Yeah, you guessed right. This ideal place is Nazi Germany. Using a trans metaphor, Borda goes as far as describing himself as an Aryan German trapped in a Guatemalan body.
Ooh, wow.
Portraying a colonized mindset, Bolaño traces how Borda develops self-hate and blames another marginalized community, Jews, for his brutal experiences in the Anglo-white dominated cultural spaces he navigates in the U.S.
This seems to me like very similar to the idea of like, you know, you pit one oppressed group against another oppressed group so that the oppressor can continue to oppress, right?
Yeah, like it's a divide and conquer technique.
If they're busy like being mad at each other, then I can continue in my position of power. The hierarchy
stays intact.
Yeah.
So his response is to develop a white mask in the Fanonian sense. And let me explain that. Frank Fanon's concept of the white mask refers to the psychological phenomenon where colonized individuals adopt the colonizer's cultural, linguistic, and behavioral traits in an attempt to gain acceptance and validation within colonial society.
Okay.
This process involves suppressing or fully rejecting their own cultural identity and internalizing the values and norms of the dominant white culture, leading to a sense of alienation and self-estrangement. Fanon explored this idea in his book Black Skin's White Mask, highlighting the detrimental effects on the psyches of Afro-descendants and the broader implications for colonial power dynamics.
Okay.
Returning to Bolaño, the indigenous Borda assumes not only a white mask, but a white supremacy mask to suppress his Guatemalan culture and empower himself in his search for validation in the U.S.
Yeah. Wow.
So those are the three stories that Bolaño puts together in this section of speculative and science fiction literature. Yeah. In conclusion, La Obra de Roberto Bolaño presents a critique of fascism weaving into a broader context of his literary exploration of violence, power, and human fragility. His critique often focuses on how fascist ideologies infiltrate society's literature and individual psyches. In works like La Literatura Nazi en las Américas, Bolaño uses satire and fictional biographies to expose the horror of fascist sympathies within literary and cultural spheres. He creates portraits of fictional writers whose beliefs are grotesque and plausible, highlighting how such ideologies can pervade many Latin American and Latina intellectual and artistic communities. Through fragmented narrative and interconnected stories, he reveals the lingering trauma and moral decay that fascism inflicts on both victims and perpetrators. In resonance with current times, Bolaño's critique extends to the complicity and apathy of those who enable or ignore fascist movements, He portrays how intellectual artists and ordinary people can become unwitting or willing participants in oppressive systems. By blending fiction with historical and political realities, Bolaño challenges readers to confront the enduring dangers of fascism and the complex interplay between ideology, art, and power.
I really like that because you're using the historical to talk not just about the historical, but about the continuing present and potential futures. All right. Well, thank you for sharing that. I think while the story I'm going to be discussing is different, I think we'll find some overlap here. So I think while your focus or the focus of Bolaño's work here was on blending fiction with historical and political realities, La Madrina, the story I'm going to be discussing, is about blending fiction with contemporary social realities. Although obviously the social and political overlap. So La Madrina is a short story about a house built on a road between life and death, and about a young woman named Rocio who stumbles across it. So here she encounters La Madrina, a personified cosmic force who helps those who find themselves at death's door. We find out towards the end La Madrina is actually death herself, but she's also a godmother type figure who helps lead souls to the beyond. That is, if it is their time. So La Madrina determines whether a soul goes to heaven or hell, or if they should return to the real world. In rare occasions, as with our protagonist, she allows someone to stay on as an assistant. So let's talk about this assistant, Rocio, for a moment. As I mentioned earlier in the episode, speculative elements of speculative fiction are woven together with elements of reality. In this case, the reality is quite dark. And while it's never explicitly stated, it's evident that Rocio has escaped a situation in which she was being exploited for sexual labor. The story opens up with our protagonist being abandoned on the side of the road by a lower level pimp of sorts. At least that's what we can kind of figure his role is. He's like a middleman. Rocio has given up on life at this point. She's abused and battered and feels as though she cannot be fixed. She states, "I was done with life, done. Heaven wouldn't want me all ruined like this in body and soul, and I was tired of hell." So basically, she feels as though heaven is an impossibility for her and that she's already actually lived through hell. So like there isn't going to be something worse, and she wants nothing to do with that. So this is where she's kind of at this line of like, well, I don't really want to die. I'm done with life, but I don't necessarily want to die. For her, reality is hell. So let's bring in the speculative elements. In this case, the speculative is hope. When reality seems impossible to survive, creating a universe with a sort of quote-unquote fairy godmother type figure provides both the reader and the narrator with something good to hold on to, right? Something positive. Our first real speculative element comes in the form of the yellow light from the fireflies. While the Rocio fears the light, it leads her to the house where she'll find safety. She's ready to give up, to close her eyes and never wake up. And while fireflies are not magical in and of themselves, their role here as guides to finding help is borderline supernatural. As the light on the porch finishes pulling her towards the house, she's closed in by moths behind her, which prevent her from escaping from the shack.
She crosses a portal.
Yeah, exactly. That's a great way of putting it.
And there's many portals in this story.
Yes. Yeah.
You will talk about this.
I'll get there. I will. So again, these insect guides that seem to be assisting La Madrina might appear as something scary or fearsome, right? Because they're unknown. But really, they're signs of hope for help, right? They're saying, like, you've passed this portal, you've passed this line. We want you to get the help and protection you need. And help is exactly what she receives. Rocio explains, La Madrina spooned honeyed tea into my mouth, the taste of the yerba mate enhanced by jasmine and rose. She cleaned my skin, she washed me, and with her touch, she soothed the bruises and cuts the road and the men had inflicted on me. And that's where we get like our insight to the Argentinian side of this, right? The yerba mate mention.
Yeah. So La Madrina is also a herbalist. Una curandera, exactly.
Mm-hmm. While on the surface, this behavior can be seen as nursing someone back to health, The touch of La Madrina soothed not only the current wounds, but also, it seems, past wounds that Rocio had suffered. She mentions men, plural, had inflicted bruises and cuts. So to me, this seems to indicate that these wounds were deeper than surface level, right?
Probably psychological wounds as well.
Absolutely, right? And a touch does not cure a wound, not literally. So there's definitely something seemingly magical about La Madrina right from the start. Honestly, she's called La Madrina. That should be the giveaway. Mm-hmm. That's often the role of La Madrina characters. So Rocio sleeps, and when she wakes up, she's uncertain if it's the next day or like how long she's slept, how long she's been there, because her wounds seem to be gone, but she feels like she only arrived the night before. So the time passing is very unclear here. She sees a line of people of all ages waiting to be directed by La Madrina, who leads them through a door to a room.
Another portal.
Yeah, exactly. So in her first day there, when she sees the people passing through the door, Rocio notes that one of two things seems to happen. Either there's a darkness and the sounds of torture, or there is a soft yellow light, which she seems to think is like soothing, welcoming. Now, no one who enters the room returns, but not everyone passes through the door. La Madrina sends some of the people waiting in the line back out into the world. And then there are people who resist passing through the door. They're not ready, right? Others resist going back to where they came from. They want to pass through the door. And some willingly and openly accept the path La Madrina chooses for them. No one gets to stay. No one except Rocio, that is.
So it's also like about how different people react to the possibilities of death.
Yes. Yeah. And I find it interesting that there's people of all ages, all social classes. They're all dressed differently. They all have clearly experienced different lives. It's not just like a lineup of people from one age group or one gender or something like that, right? Death comes for everyone.
That comes for everyone indeed.
Okay. So here, of course, the implication is that we've all figured out, right? La Madrina helps guide people towards death or life. She sends them back into the world if it's not their time. And if it is, they pass through the door. But what happens to them is not her choice. It is seemingly a reflection of their actions in life. Now, Rocio grows curious, and when she begins asking questions, La Madrina tells her, "That's good. Curiosity means life. But beware, it can be dangerous too." Rocio is not going through the door, at least not yet. Like, La Madrina is not sending her through. What she does instead is take her on as an assistant. Now, this is something that she claims to have not done for a very long time, but clearly she sees something in Rocio. That curiosity that she sees means a chance to learn. Rocio's job is to lead the people to wherever La Madrina dictates and to never disobey. And she says in the story, like, she has no intention of disobeying. And as she helps out, she comes to learn that the room actually looks different for every person who passes through it. She's curious at this point, but she's still not ready to ask questions. So note obedience and not asking questions at this point in the story. But then there comes a day where a number of young women and girls arrive, all covered in bruises, who all pass through the door. Rocio recognizes one of them, and this pushes her to finally ask questions. She learns that people either go to the beyond or back home. She also learns that death is a labor of love, and that while a mother brings you into the world, a godmother ushers you out. Rocio's curiosity continues to grow until one day she does disobey. Right? Again, remember, she had obedience and she wasn't like asking questions out loud. So now she disobeys. When La Madrina tells her to usher a woman through the door, Rocio instead shows the woman how to return to her life. Well, La Madrina seems to disapprove of what Rocio has done. She's not angry. And you almost wonder if it was kind of intentional, like it was a test in this case.
Yeah, it's kind of like, it is suggested.
Yeah. She tells Rocio that when her time comes, she will lead her through the door. But it's clearly not Rocio's time, as she now decides that she's ready to leave the cottage, right? It's her time to go back home, in a sense. But I think it's more like moving forward than going back for Rocio. La Madrina blesses her as she retraces her steps back to the road she came from. La Madrina provides a soothing balm before sending the young woman back on her quest. A quest for life this time, not death. At one point, Rocio turns to look back at the house and notices that it has disappeared. I think that would be like, maybe our fourth portal now or third portal, whatever portal we're at. The portal is closed, yeah.
Yeah.
As she continues along, she notices that her injuries have returned.
But now she has a different mind frame about it.
Exactly, right? So this begs the question, how long was she at the cottage? But also, was there ever really a cottage? Is death or La Madrina a monster? Can monsters be good? Or maybe a better question is, who are the real monsters in this story? So Rocio may be injured still, but she knows that she's walking towards life and that she has, in essence, been given a second chance. So what will she do with it? According to Said Mendez, the author, right, she loves this character because she sees her as strong and curious. And she says, even though life hasn't been kind to her, she still recognizes the beauty in it. So I think what I want to dive into here real quick is just this idea that curiosity really pairs well with speculative fiction. When you have a character who seeks to better understand the world and their place in it, introducing elements that are magical or supernatural or outside of our current realities, you give them and the reader an opportunity to learn. Having a strong character who's able to overcome adversities also allows the reader to connect with the struggles of others. And so, while La Madrina is not fully a horror story in the traditional sense, it is a monster story, right? Which can be horrifying or terrifying. And just a side note to differentiate the two, right? Horror is the feeling that follows a frightening situation, while terror is the anticipation of a horrifying situation.
It's also a spiritual story.
It is. It is a spiritual story.
It could be read through the perspective of a spirituality and even religion.
Yeah. Well, and I think a big part of that comes back to questioning who is the actual monster, right? Like, La Madrina is the supernatural force, but is she the monster, right? And I'll get to that in just a moment. So why do people like these kind of stories? What causes them to gravitate towards horror stories and monster stories, or even these sort of supernatural spiritual stories? For one, it can be mentally stimulating. It can also be a safe way to satisfy one's curiosity about the dark side of humanity. Interestingly, for me anyway, in this particular story, we're more so escaping the dark side of humanity, right? If the real monsters are the men who hurt Rocio, then her time with La Madrina is a reprieve from that reality.
Yeah, it is a story that allows to think about domestic violence, general violence against women, right, within our patriarchal societies.
Exactly, right? This particular story provides the readers and Rocio with a novel experience that wouldn't happen in the real world. Could someone find safety in the home of another? Sure. But remember, this isn't just some woman. This is death herself. Monster stories and the horror terror brand of speculative fiction provides what some might consider a protective frame for the reader. So what does that entail? Well, 3 things. First, safety. Knowing that you're safe and that the evil, monstrous entity cannot harm you. Second, detachment. Separating yourself from the horror that's on the page and knowing that the experience is not real. And 3, and I think probably one of the most important here, is control, right? Having the confidence that you can control and overcome the dangers you encounter. So La Madrina is just one example of the direction a monster story can take. Our Shadows Have Claws, the collection, provides readers with a wide variety of stories. Some where the monster is the darkness or the evil, but others where the true evil is humanity, and the so-called monsters or supernatural beings are actually there to protect us from the true evil. But what each of these stories provide, no matter the direction they take, is a sense of safety, a degree of detachment from the events of the story, and the feeling of control over one's situation, if even just for that moment.
Es una pausa.
That's a perfect way of putting it.
Rocío experienced a pausa from the violence she endured, and that allows her healing, right? Regardless if it was something real or not.
Yeah. Our Shadows Have Claws include stories with fantastical creatures like the boogeyman and vampires, but it also shares stories with more metaphorical monsters, right? Misogyny and racism, natural and environmental destruction, colonialism, and more. So, the stories are all very separate. They're all written by different authors. They all touch on different issues. And they come from a variety of countries or people with different ancestral backgrounds. So there's diversity in that sense as well. What I really like here is that instead of monster stories that warn children and young women to behave themselves in ways that satisfy the patriarchy, the stories in this collection provide consequences for the colonizers, for the exploiters, for bigots and bullies. These are the people who suffer in the stories in this collection. We see that with La Madrina as the men with the rumpled business suit, for me anyway, a symbol of corruption of power, perhaps. We see him encounter the darkness as he passes through the door and not the soft yellow light.
Darkness and torture.
Yes.
That's important, especially within the context of Latin America. Yeah.
No, that's an excellent point. As Orquídea Morales explains in her article, The Horror in Gloria Anzaldúa, Reclaiming the Monstrous is the other and what we have come to hate and are afraid to be. It is the thing we fear in ourselves too. It is framed as primitive, intellectually weak, dark. So with this story being written by a woman and featuring a female protagonist, it's not shocking that the other in this case, which normally we think of as the more marginalized group, but in this case, I think the other is the patriarchy, right? It's misogyny. And perhaps it's even a bit of internalized misogyny, right? As we see Rocío believing that she is not worth it. Her life is not worth it.
There's no alternative to the type of life she's leading with these men.
Yeah, no escape. Exactly. But the story punches up when it comes to the other, right? We talk about that with humor a lot, but I think it's interesting to consider in this case, right? Here, the other is the one who holds power or allegedly holds power, right? Because as this story shows, those who believe they hold the power are actually intellectually weak, while those that truly have the power, and here I would say La Madrina and eventually Rocío, are the characters who actually demonstrate true strength. And as Morales states later in her article, women are monstrous only as constructed by patriarchy, so that an exploitation of their monstrousness tells us more about masculinity and the fears of patriarchy than anything else. La Madrina flips this exploration in a way that centers around the experiences of the women and the monster that is the patriarchy instead. All right, so let's connect these. I think the first thing that came to my mind was a critique of systems of power and oppression, specifically fascism and patriarchy.
Yeah, those two words are the keywords, the two main concepts that are like embedded within these fictions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, speculative fiction is often considered a safer space to critique these systems of power and oppression. When a story is completely reality-based, there's a greater risk for condemnation from those exact systems of power that are being critiqued. By using a speculative setting, it allows a buffer between the oppressor and the oppressed.
Indeed, in the case of Bolaño, he could have written on actual right-wing and fascist writers in the Americas, because there are many. But by writing on fictional characters, he focused on the ideologies they share, making the reader reflect on discourses and political agendas and literary agendas, of course, instead of getting into a beef with another writer or their states.
Right. No, that's a great point. You know, we're telling the story of reality through these fictional characters. Yeah,
in the case of the Rocío story, also we see also we can reflect on real feminine spaces of care that exist throughout the Americas as well, right?
Yeah.
And feminist organizing as well.
Right, that sort of matriarchal system of care.
Precisely. Or indigenous matriarchal systems of care as well.
Yeah. I think both of these stories also emphasize fear, right? Yeah, like, well, your example wasn't strictly speaking horror-based. It was a human as monster story to a certain degree. At least that's how I saw it, right? Because the true monster is the oppressor, and the authors, through Bolaño's narration, are feeding into systems of oppression, colonialism, racism, violence, etc. Right? Bolaño critiques fascism through leaning into these authors embracing this darkness.
Yeah, I'm thinking that precisely you were talking about the other. The other in this case are marginalized, racialized, gendered communities, right? And they're seen as a danger, as a menace to U.S. society in this particular case, because the book also like covers other geographies.
Right. This is just one small section. Right, La Madrina is also a human as monster story, but it leaves the monster on the periphery. Instead of critiquing the monsters through others who lean into it, La Madrina reframes the patriarchal horrors of contemporary society.
One thing that I like about the story is that it doesn't, although the violence is described and suggested, it doesn't reproduce it. Instead, it brings to the fore the spaces of care and healing.
Yeah.
You said it well. La Madrina focuses more on healing and the creation of feminist spaces of support connected to nature. Yeah, and that is also like very important. And I read also as also like a hint towards indigeneity.
Yes.
And but also a space of self-reflection. I think that was also like very important, that we all need spaces in which we can grow through self-reflection. And Rocio has that opportunity through that pause, whatever that pause was.
Yeah, right? We have no idea how long it was, whether it was real, whether it was like she was just
maybe it was
knocked
just
out
like
on the side of the
glimpse
road.
of a moment while she was like lying on the floor, right, after the quote unquote accident, right,
Yeah.
that she had on the road. But it was an important moment of self-reflection and healing.
Yes, and I think it's an important moment for that because she was filled with so much self-hatred, which is something I noticed in the third author that you talked about, Gustavo Borda, right? He sort of doubles down seeking validation through the oppressor by like moving to Nazi Germany and trying to like, you know.
Yeah, Bolaño writes that he writes of speculative worlds, right? Alternative worlds, but they all have names of German towns. So it's New Frankfurt, for example.
Okay.
New Berlin, etc., etc.
Rocio also overcomes her self-hatred, but in her case, there's an important difference, and something that you've also mentioned with the sort of indigenous matriarchal care systems.
Curandera system, yeah.
Yeah, she has support and care from La Madrina, and that helps her overcome the self-hatred, which Borda never does.
Yes, for the fictional Borda, whiteness and the power dynamics of fascism are approachable, and he sees them as refuge because he can extract the benefit that comes from whiteness and from fascism. Although, and that is the irony of this particular text, although only through his fiction. Because Bolaño described how he led a very like sad and tragic life.
Right,
yeah,
that he was like
a victim of racism, right? Deeply rejected.
Yeah.
So the story serves as
Our
a way.
fictional author escapes into his own fictional realm.
Yeah, there's like many layers. Bolaño is very like that is very common in Bolaño, like the layers upon layers of fictions, right?
Yes.
And how they allow us to survive oppressive times. Thanks for joining us for this episode. Remember, you can also share your thoughts by contacting us on social media or by email.
You can follow the podcast on Twitter and Instagram at Latinx Visions. Our email address is latinxvisions@gmail.com. Be sure to subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts and share us with your friends and family. Subscribe and leave a 5-star review.
This is Rojo.
And Rebecca.
Signing off. Estamos a la escucha.
Dale. Until next time.